Welcome back to Assessing Options for Drought Response, number 7, Impact of the Response Strategy on Recovery. This is the last in the series of responding to drought. And let's just recap a little bit, go back to this respond to drought where we started, and we talked about the questions that arise when responding to drought. And they were about, do I sell, adjust feed, or take a chance on rain? And we've looked at some of those questions, and we've looked at how those options can be compared. In one case, we looked at comparison of the cost of getting through our breeders through the drought, and then we looked at the most profitable way, or the least impact way, to move forward through the drought. And that was about what do I sell first and why. And the why was about doing the least damage to the future prospects of the property. And now we come to this sort of idea about, okay, we've been concentrating on the immediate problem and dealing with the immediate problem, but then we've got to think about, does my response now, what I do to sell, adjust or feed, decide my recovery strategy when it rains. And we go back to our context diagram where the major part of our thinking is consumed by drought. It dominates our thinking. And that the idea that drought response strategies are often seen as tactical short term, but we discovered this idea that the decisions we make in preparing for drought will really affect the drought response and the choices we are allowed to make and the choices that confront us. And then those choices will affect our medium-term outcomes and our impact on future profit and cash flow. So all these things are related, and the choices we make here in terms of rebuilding the herd and recovering from drought should be led and should be directed by what is the most profitable and drought-resilient strategy for our property. So in terms of the context, it's a strategic view of how the drought response, the decisions made prior to the drought, and how rebuilding from drought are all closely linked, and they depend a little bit on each other. So the impact of the response strategy on recovery. So we're going to again use some tools to assess the impact of drought response strategies on recovery. All the examples that we're going to have in this presentation are built in the BreedCow Dynamo software, so it's available free of charge on our DAF external website, and you can download it from this link. Impact on the recovery in numbers. So let's look a little bit longer term. We're previously making decisions in previous presentations about let's just sell these cows, or let's just sell these steers, or let's just sell these heifers, because that does the least impact on our prospects when we come out of the drought. And in this case, we're going to have a look at a little bit longer term, over time, of an option to sell PTE breeders, or an alternative option of selling down the young stock. So to start that process in a Dynamo Plus model, which is a 10-year or 30-year model livestock trading schedule, which you can do profit analysis and cash flow analysis in, we built our typical North Queensland Gulf herd into that model, and our starting numbers were the pre-drought numbers of the number of weaners and then the number of heifers in each age group, the number of cows in each age group. Now they come out of the BreedCow Plus model. It splits a herd up into age groups automatically based on our culling strategy of our heifers and cows and our maximum age. We keep our cows in the herd. So there's our starting herd, and we've also got a group of steer weaners that are coming through. We've got 1-year-old steers, 2-year-old steers that are lining up to be sold, our tail of our steers that weren't sold last year, some herd bulls. So that gives us total cattle on the property. Now, our normal sales that we normally take out of that herd, if things are going on average, we normally have our heifers that we cull pre-mating, our heifers that are culled empty, and they are all sold, and then we take out of each of our cow groups about 10% based on their status of our empty cows to balance our herd based on what we think our normal number of heifers coming in will be. And then we sell all these age cows on age here in this age group. So there's our normal sales, our normal steer sales, the lead and the tail, and a few herd bulls. So we would normally sell about 518 in total. There's one weaner there being sold for some reason in this model, and 517 adults. Now, in option A to sell the PTE breeders, this is our drought response. We've got to reduce the numbers by that 25-30%. So in this part of the model, we've said, okay, instead of normal sales, let's go through and pull out of each age group of females the PTE empties, the preg test empties, the ones that at pregnancy diagnosis show up as not detectable or don't have a calf in them. So there they are there, and you can see we're now selling 787 total cattle, 786 adults. So it's a couple of hundred, 250, 260, 270 more. The other option, instead of selling our PTE breeders and reducing our herd numbers that way, we could sell the young stock. Leave the breeding herd as it is, keep the PTEs, and sell out our heifer weaners, a big wing of our steers, not all of them, and all our next year's stale steers and our normal steers. So in that case, we're selling 1,143, total adult 791. So we're selling a lot of young stock. There's our sale numbers. So there's our two options we want to assess. And when we put those in the model and allow the model to rebuild to its long-term herd target, so we make the sales in the first year, we reduce our grazing pressure. This is the number of adult equivalents on the property. This is the number of years going forward. We reduce our grazing pressure, and selling the PTE breeders or selling the young stock gives us about the same outcome in terms of the remaining number of stock in terms of grazing pressure on the property when we've done that. Then we allow the herd to just rebuild, and we still sell a few culls out of it to get a bit of cash flow, but the target is to get back to that long-term herd structure that we started with. So you can see there's different effects here, that if you sell the PTEs, of course, you've got a lot less, you miss that, their weaners on the second year coming through, so the numbers are down, but then the young stock are still there, so they come through and they start producing calves and your numbers build back up. Whereas if you sell the young stock and hold the PTEs, you have a bounce in your numbers, but then because you sold the young stock, you don't have young heifers coming through to replace your breeders. You're having to really struggle for breeder numbers, so your cattle numbers don't build up for quite a bit longer. But either way, there is a significant lag between, we're pretending the drought's broken here, and when you get your numbers back. So there's 8 or 10 years there where you're understocked. So the points here are it takes a considerable period of time before the property returns to its capacity if the normal culling and selling procedures are resumed. So we don't sell the normal numbers, but we enforce a normal culling strategy to rebuild our numbers. We retain more heifers, but we sell the normal steers and the numbers that are coming through. So the decision to sell down the young stock, including the weaner heifers, causes a significant lag in rebuilding. So there's your significant lag there compared to the decision to sell down the PTE females. Although the initial reduction in grazing pressure and resulting cash in bank is similar. So here's our cash flow. This is our cumulative debt cash flow over time. You can see in the first year when you sell either, your cash at bank balance is basically the same, young stock or PTE breeders. But then because you've kept the young stock, when you sell the PTEs, you've got them to sell the next year, and then the cash flow falls away as you don't have enough cattle coming through. And with the selling the young stock, you can have a similar sort of impact where you have about the same cash at bank. But then after that, the breeders, selling the PTE breeders, the option there of holding the young stock, rebuild your herd numbers a bit quicker. So the choice made of how many to sell and when will impact the capacity of the property to serve its commitments. This is our no drought cash flow, our imaginary line here. So you can see between what we hoped would happen and what has happened in allowing our herd to rebuild, there's a large gap in cash flow. That's going to cause problems. Now, the choice to sell down the PTE breeders provides the same amount of cash. We said that. The retention of the younger females to rebuild the breeder herd associated with this strategy allows the cash balance to be maintained, and then it builds back. Now, the point being that we made in our short-term analysis in previous presentations was sell the stock that do the least damage to your profit. If we sell the PTEs, which was sort of the indication of sell the breeders in our previous examples, you can see here if you sort of took the net present value of that cash flow and took the net present value of this cash flow that ends up at a lower point, probably this one will give you a better outcome long term than that one. But still, there's a significant gap in our cash flow with either option here that we need to think about. So, both you get this problem that you end up with this significant deficit in 5 or 6 years' time that you need to do something about. Let's think about this. Okay, it's apparent that letting the herd rebuild slowly is going to seriously impact on the ongoing viability of this property. It's necessary then to identify strategies that efficiently fill the gap and between the actual grazing pressure applied and the total carrying capacity available. So let's think about that. So one option is to send the PTE breeders on agistment. So instead of selling those PTE breeders, let's send them on agistment for 12 months and not sell them. We'll get them back once the season is broken off the agistment. So we worked out, and here's our agistment line here. The blue line is our imaginary no drought. So if we don't sell them, we don't get this jump in cash at bank because we don't release that capital. And we calculated $150 a head or $300 a head. You remember our agistment exercise was over $300 a head previously for a fairly lengthy period of agistment, but here's just two levels of agistment cost, and you can see the cheaper agistment costs, it comes out of your cash, they come home, and then your herd goes back to normal, and the difference between the cash flow lines is just the cost of agistment in that first year. And you can see it rebuilds fairly quickly over time, and it's probably a more livable result than selling the PTE breeders. But successfully finding agistment that allows the breeder herd to perform at a similar level is going to be problematic. And incurring the short-term cost of expensive agistment may be a viable option. We can see that here. It gets your total cash flow ends up better over the longer term than dramatically getting the cash by selling down the herd. But there's some. It might be viable, but finding it is problematic. And thinking about this is just short-term agistment, 12 months. It's a drought response strategy, but longer-term agistment, where you send breeders onto country, long-term on agistment, that's a different scenario, different costs and returns. You would have to analyse it slightly differently. Now, obviously, agistment's not easy to find in periods of drought, so if no agistment can be found and the sell down occurs, strategies that efficiently fill the gap between potential income and realised income while the herd is rebuilding need to be identified. So we have here our total carrying capacity and adult equivalents of our property. No drought, that's our expected carrying capacity of our property. And then by year, if we sell the PTE breeders, you can see in the first year there's a little bit of a sell down, but then after that, as the herd restructures, rebuilds over time, you can see there's 300 or more adult equivalent spare grazing there for a number of years. So what we need to do is identify available options for filling this gap. They will probably include, we could purchase some cows and calves. Okay, we sell the PTE breeders. After the drought, we go out and buy cows and calves to rebuild the herd faster. We could take cattle on agistment, equivalent to that gap in the grazing pressure. We could purchase groups of steers, heifers, or cows and calves as turnover stock. In that way, we could trade cattle, not keep them, just buy them to try and put weight on them or put condition on them or turn them off just as turnover stock. That is, they are purchased specifically as a trading option. Or we could repurchase the components of the herd that were sold to rebuild numbers. So if we sold PDEs, we could buy PDEs. If we sold a wing of steers and heifers, we could buy them. Or we could possibly do a combination of all those depending on what we thought was best. So they're the options we've got to think about. We won't cover them in this presentation. We will look at those in presentation 8, and we'll look at those recovery strategies in more detail, and they will be purchase the cows and calves, take cattle on agistment, trade cattle, or repurchase the components that were sold down. Let's do a bit of a summary of the drought response strategy. So this is the 7th presentation, and we've done the previous ones. Let's just go back and summarise what we were thinking about. So we started with this idea that the drought response strategies are tactical, but we're now thinking about that's not always correct. The options available to respond to drought are often and quite often determined by the decisions made prior to drought in terms of herd structure, strategic direction of the herd, culling age, things like that. The actions taken in response to drought will also often determine the medium-term outcomes for the property once the drought breaks. So there's a link there between the decisions made or what class of cattle to sell, whether to feed or agist, will determine the medium-term outcomes once the beef property Therefore, we're saying in all these strategies, the consideration of the alternative responses should initially be undertaken by looking at the immediate impacts on the components of the herd in isolation, which is what we did. We said, let's compare the PTEs or the PTICs with the steers. Looked at each component in isolation, and we looked at the marginal costs and benefits plus the risks of the actions associated with the alternative responses. And then we're saying, okay, once you've done that, the final assessment of the sale of the alternative classes of cattle should also take into account the impact on both future profit and cash flow over the medium term, which is what we've done just in the start of this presentation. We've looked at the cash flow out over time. And we've made it pretty clear that nobody's exempt from scrutiny, that all classes of cattle should be incorporated in the assessment. Thank you.